So, hi everyone. Thank you all for being here at the Diversity Outreach and Inclusion Affinity Group's second BPRG event. Thank you especially to Dr. Jae Sevelius for sharing your time and insights with us today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the actions that the DOI has taken since its inception in January, seeing that this is our last DOI event of the year. So we crafted the BPRG statement of acknowledgement, change, and solidarity with the Black community and all who work towards racial equity and social justice. We created a document of suggested questions for all BPRG speakers in order to promote a framework related to diversity outreach and inclusion in psychedelic research and presentations. We hope that all future BPRG speakers will use these as guidelines for topics to address during their talks. We created a database of research publications involving the intersection of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy and race-based trauma, mental health disparities, culturally adaptive treatments, and more. And we're also excited to see our vision reach organizations outside of the BPRG. So the Boston University Medical Center approved Mackenzie's proposal to host a seminar on diversity, racial equity, and social justice in psychedelic research protocols for their research professionals network. Also, this year, the DOI was asked to provide input into 2 psychedelic-assisted therapy research trials. So we created a document for Yvonne Bossant's pilot trial of psilocybin-assisted therapy in hospice patients for consideration of diversity, equity, and inclusion in areas of the research, such as team makeup, data analysis, and patient recruitment. And in response to a request from folks at the Aquilino Cancer Center in Maryland, with the collaboration of the Dana-Farber Cancer Center, we curated a list of musical resources and suggestions for crafting playlist components in psychedelic-assisted therapy that are more inclusive and responsive to cultural diversity. We're honored to provide our input in all of the materials that we have crafted, our open resources for anyone who want their work with psychedelics to be more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. So we're just happy to share everything that we've created with as many people as possible. And we look forward to furthering our mission in the new year. One last thing before we begin, I want to give a special thank you to Anne, whose involvement with the DOI has been integral to our growth. She supported the DOI from the very beginning, attending nearly all of our meetings, and has been very receptive to our input. And of course, thank you to Sherry for making everything happen every day. I swear she must have a clone or something. And with that, I'll hand it over to Mackenzie before Sherry puts us into breakout rooms. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Georgie, just hearing you say those things, there's some things in there that I absolutely forgot that we even did this year because being on Zoom is just consuming. In light of what Georgie said, we've been really heavy on racial equity, and we are not necessarily moving away from that, but we are also thinking as a group on different areas of expression that may be marginalized or not thought of typically in this space. So today we are very excited to have Jae Sevelius with us. I'll introduce Jae in a little bit, but before we do that, we wanted to get to know each other and mix it up a little bit. So I'm gonna pop a question in the chat for people to think about as we put you into some random breakout rooms. Also, if you don't know each other, I'm sure most of us probably already do, but get to know each other, develop a little bit of sense of community, and I hope you enjoy spending some time together. And we'll bring you back after. Sherry? Awesome. So it looks like we have everybody back. I hope that was interesting for most folk. I want to hear if you're willing to tell me just a couple of people that maybe learn something new about somebody or about the topic we're going to dive into here in a second. Does anybody want to raise their hand and share something with us? There's got to be a brave soul on camera somewhere. Oh, come on, don't leave me in the quiet. I'll sit here all day. I'm kidding. Penelope, are you raising? Julia raised her hand too. Julia O'Brien, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I am new, so I learned about everyone in my little breakout group and a bit about what y'all are doing and the background of it and the relationship to the diversity and inclusion component. So yeah, I mean, I learned quite a lot. I don't know if I have anything specific to say, but that's pretty much it. And hello to everyone.
Awesome.
Mackenzie, I'll say something.
All right, Shep.
There was a sense in our group that it would be very nice to have smaller group interactions with people so they could get to know each other on a more personal level. And obviously everybody can have access to the emails, but I just wanted to share that. It's not mine. It was Penelope who asked that, but I thought it was a wonderful idea and I'd like to second it.
Now, did you have something to add?
I was going to say I'll third it, although, I guess, I think of it wasn't that long ago, only 6 months, that we were able to kind of actually, talk in the same place. And maybe it won't be until next summer or whatever when we can do it again. But I do hope that when we're able to physically meet again, that adds back some of the way we always met before COVID caused us to do everything via Zoom. I don't know what you think, Shippen, if that's, or maybe even the way we used to do it isn't quite enough, and there might be some other opportunities for people to get to know one another better.
Well, I want to put in a plug, Ron, for Ron and I are working on a scholarship program for the BPRG. And I want to put in a plug that if you're interested and have friends who are interested, colleagues, let us know. And if you're interested and have the financial capacity to give to a scholarship program, let us know. We want to basically put on, support as many people as we can in the current and the April BPRG, a CPTR program in Boston. And we want to put those people on our website with their pictures and stories. And so people can know that this is a viable pathway to getting into this work because it's absolutely critical.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Absolutely. And Penelope, you came off mute. I just want to make sure you had an opportunity to add if you wanted to.
I got to know Ann and Shippen better. I know them. And Keelan in Oakland. Yeah, I want to get to know some people better. So I'm going to reach out myself and maybe we can do some one-to-one Zooming in the meantime until something better happens.
Absolutely.
Okay?
That sounds wonderful.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, it's great to hear that people got to connect. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker of the day. Today we have Jae Sevelius with us, who they and them is a PhD, not a candidate, a PhD, an associate professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, and is a licensed clinical psychologist. At the Center of Excellence for Transgender Health, Dr. Sevelius is community-engaged, NIH-funded research is focused on developing and evaluating trauma-informed interventions to promote holistic health and wellness among transgender and gender-diverse people. Dr. Sevelius holds a certificate in psychedelic-assisted therapies and research from the California Institute of Integral Studies. Their research and clinical interests lie at the intersections of social justice, sexuality, health, and identity. And they have published several articles advocating for the expansion of psychedelic research to diversify leadership, community engagement, and study design. So I'll stop talking and pass it off to Jae.
Thank you so much, Mackenzie. It's really great to be here and to see all your faces. I think one of the benefits of Zoom is that I get to talk to you all from my living room in San Francisco, and you all are in Boston, and I get to meet you and see what you all are doing and hear about the DOI efforts, which are really amazing. And just want to congratulate this group for such incredible, inspiring work. Thank you, Anne, for inviting me. Anne and I had the pleasure of being part of the first cohort of the CIIS Certificate in Psychedelic Assisted Therapies and Research together. So that was a really beautiful experience. And back in the time when we got to be together in person and go on retreats, and it was just a very very expanding kind of experience. So it's really a thrill to talk to you all today. And let's see, I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. Oh, hold on, let me make sure I do this correctly. And just a side note, I do live kind of in the heart of San Francisco, so there is always a chance that I may need to mute myself due to very loud sirens right outside my window that I don't want to subject you to. So if that happens, I'll let you know. But basically, what I am interested in talking with you all today about is the concept of queering psychedelics. And as Mackenzie mentioned, my research, my primary research is around transgender and gender diverse health. So I spend a lot of time, I work for a medical school, I spend a lot of time thinking about how to create research agendas that are more inclusive of trans and gender diverse people, how our current Western medical model really excludes and dismisses gender diversity and sort of the unique experiences and needs that gender diverse communities have. And so in my own psychedelic research and in digesting psychedelic research, I bring this perspective, this lens to thinking about the questions that we're asking. And today, I just want to introduce some concepts and ideas from queer theory and also from my own research with trans and gender diverse communities to quote unquote queer our discussion of psychedelic research and start to think about which questions get asked based on who is asking the questions. And I also want to explore what might be possible in terms of bringing healing to trans and gender diverse people who do bear a disproportionate brunt of trauma, especially for those who are also people of color, whose life experiences are shaped by intersectional impacts of things like racism, transphobia, sexism, heterosexism. So in the breakout rooms, we invited you to start to think about how your own identities and social positions shape the questions that you ask about psychedelics. And as we continue this discussion, I invite you to also think about how psychedelics may have in turn shaped your identities and your concept of yourself. So let's start with the title, Queering Psychedelics. This comes from queer theory, this idea of queering. And queer theory is kind of an umbrella discipline, a critical philosophy where we bring a lens that really resists this idea that people fall into neat categories that are fixed. And what happens when we categorize people is some identities are constructed as normal, whereas others are constructed as deviant. So for example, we construct these ideas of binary gender categories that organize our society, but really in our lived experiences, we see that gender is much more complex than a binary. We see people living outside of the gender binary, across the gender binary. There's a lot more diversity within groups than there is between groups. And gender really is more like a fractal than a binary. But because we organize our society this way, it's often difficult to really function with this lens of complexity. And we continue to kind of reinforce this, this socially constructed binary in terms of how we do our research, the questions we ask, how we collect our data. And these categories have tangible consequences on how we live our lives and how people experience things like sexism and transphobia. And queer theory does tend to focus on sexuality and gender identity because it really arose out of this realm of activism. But queer theory asserts that all identities are social constructions. So for example, this also applies to race, where some races are constructed as the norm and other races are constructed as different or deviations from the norm. And you can really see this when you look at research that has been designed from a very normative white lens, where it's not really set up to meet the needs of people of color, and certainly not set up to meet the needs of trans and gender diverse people. So queering something, like we are queering psychedelics today, really is short for queer reading. So to queer something is to examine a body of literature with a lens for how it reproduces heteronormativity, binaries, and binary thinking in terms of identities, and how it sets certain things up as normal and other things up as deviant. And the term queer really arose out of queer activism in the late 80s and early 90s, and was reclaimed largely by LGBT people as an idea of moving past assimilationist tendencies. But I also just want to note that not all LGBT people identify with this term queer. Some people still kind of feel like it has some negative connotations that are left over from when it was used as a slur. And so it really depends on people's own personal history. But this is how we're using the term queer today. I also wanted to give just a very brief introduction to some of the terms that I'll probably be using very freely today. I'm very immersed in this body of research, so sometimes I use terms that I assume are familiar, but aren't necessarily. They may be very familiar to some of you, but I definitely don't want to leave anybody behind. So I welcome clarifying questions as well. But generally, when we talk about transgender, sometimes we'll use the term trans for short, or gender diverse. We're talking about people who have a gender identity that is different from the sex they were assigned at birth. Notice I'm not using the term opposite because we're trying to break down these binaries, but it's a different gender identity than what was assigned at birth. We all get assigned male or female at birth currently. So for example, a person who is assigned male at birth may identify as a woman. And we use the term cisgender to talk about people whose gender identity is aligned with the sex they were assigned at birth. Cisgender people often aren't used to thinking about their gender identity, but all cisgender people have gender identities too. So for example, a person who was assigned male at birth, who identifies as a man, would be considered cisgender. And someone who's non-binary is someone who identifies outside of the male-female binary. Someone who rejects the notion of binary gender. This includes people who identify as gender queer, gender fluid, gender non-conforming, and there are a ton of other gender identity terms that people use to talk about their identities. I myself identify as non-binary, and that does shape how I conduct my research and how I think about these things. So these terms are very fluid. They vary by coast to coast. There's probably different terms people are using now in Boston than in San Francisco. Age cohort, younger people are coming up with identity terms all the time that they're educating me about. These terms can evolve over one's lifetime. So typically we think about, you reach a certain stage of adulthood. Developmentally, we think, oh, you've achieved your identity. But more and more, we're seeing that identities really are more fluid across the lifespan than we originally thought. So just to talk really briefly about these terms, positionality and reflexivity. These terms are used a lot in qualitative research, but I think they're just as applicable and important in quantitative research because they ask us to think about how our social positions, how our identities influence how we see the world. And of course, this potentially biases how we see the world as well, because we just have our own lens to look from. And when we don't think about things like our positionality, what happens is these biases get infused into our research without critique, without us thinking about them. And reflexivity, when we're reflexive about our positionality, we start to understand the blind spots that we have And this is where groups like this group and the advocacy and the advisory roles that you've been able to provide to research studies really are critical, because what it's saying to me is that those researchers are recognizing that their own positionality is limited in terms of them being able to identify the biases that have been kind of baked into their study design, their research plan, their recruitment plan, all of these things. And so this is where we start to understand why it's so important to have diverse research teams, so that we get multiple perspectives and start to meet the needs of more people with the studies that we design. So this is one of my favorite quotes when thinking about these issues. Daniel Dennett in Darwin's Dangerous Idea, he said, "There is no such thing as philosophy-free science. There is only science whose philosophical baggage is taken on board without examination." So there's no such thing as science that's outside of a political context or does not have a political lens or the impact of positionality in terms of who's designing the research. Science is constantly being shaped by social forces, unexamined assumptions, funding, legal contexts that all shape what gets funded, why, whose agenda is in advancing. And so when we think about the current psychedelic research inside of the Western medical model, we really have to think about how the Western medical model continues to shape how we think about our research agenda, and think about how it's focused on this idea of pathology, which pathologies are prioritized, whose issues are prioritized, and whose needs are this research agenda meeting. So hopefully insights from this line of research can be expanded beyond pathology, but also that the findings can be applied more expansively. And so just an example of how social context shapes the research questions that we asked. And during the first wave of psychedelic research in the 50s and 60s, you may know this, Freud's theories really dominated how we thought about sexuality. Homosexuality was thought of as an illness to be cured. And in 1996, Timothy Leary gave an interview where he claimed that LSD can be used to cure homosexuality. And around that same time, Richard Alpert, who is later Ram Dass, also gave one of the earliest reports of using psychedelics for conversion therapy, or to convert people who were quote unquote homosexual to cure them and make them heterosexual, and talked about his success in using LSD in this way. Later, upon reflecting on this lens through which Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert were applying their research, both ended up retracting this idea that quote unquote homosexuality was an illness in need of a cure. And so kind of dropped that line of research. And we're still to this day thinking about the impact and the trauma that conversion therapies have inflicted upon queer communities. And you know, it's certainly not unique to psychedelic research, but it's just an example of how our kind of social programming really shapes the questions that we ask, and then can lead us to actually refute or refine how we think about you know, the questions that we ask in the future. So a more current example of how our social programming sort of blinds us to some of the assumptions that we're making in current study designs. You all may know that for the most part, although I think that there may be some loosening of this requirement, psychedelic therapy teams are required to function as dyads, where there's one man and one woman. And the idea behind this is to reflect the quote unquote parental structure. And I don't know how obvious the problematic nature of this is to some of you, but of course this reinforces this idea of heteronormativity when it comes to parenting, and reinforces a binary, this idea that there are, there's one woman and one man, leads us to ask the question, okay, is there room for non-binary identified folks on a therapy team? What about people who were not raised by one woman and one man? What about people who have severe trauma that they're working out from being rejected by their parents, for being trans or queer? And when therapy teams are not adequately trained to work with issues like that, reproducing parental structures can also actually be re-traumatizing. There's currently no empirical evidence that this is a beneficial therapy team structure, but it's just sort of been taken on as a way to control certain variables. One psychologist, prominent psychedelic researcher who I asked about this, told me that this is to, provide a context for which people can kind of work out their family of origin issues with their parents, but then also subsequently gave an example of a woman that he was working with, who was working out her mother issues with him in a session, and he was providing this as an example of projection and how you work with projection in a session. But what that said to me, looking through my particular lens, was that you don't actually need to be the same gender of the parent whose issues you're working out in order to allow that projection to happen, in order to work with that projection. So there's this assumption about gender and that therapists cannot work with people who are projecting issues from other genders in sessions. So if we don't question these kinds of assumptions, if we don't bring a lens that allows us to think about how social programming is getting infused into these protocols, by default, we end up centering heterosexist assumptions, white assumptions, and ultimately not being as client-centered as we imagine that we are being. So as you know, contemporary research is really focused on this Western medical model. This is the framework that we're working within in current research. So we're working with PTSD, treatment-resistant depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder. People have framed psychedelics as a treatment in search of a pathology because it has the potential to address or to open up realms of healing for so many different kinds of mental health issues that we're struggling with in our society today. So the potential applications are really wide ranging. But I just want to point out that although we are working with trauma and we have all of this evidence that psychedelics can provide healing for so many different types of mental health conditions, the majority of participants in psychedelic clinical trials are white and cisgender and heterosexual, for that matter, if the trial even collects that information, which many do not. However, when you look at the data, this is just a brief snapshot of some very large studies of trans youth, cis youth, trans adults, and cis adults. And you can see that both trans youth and trans adults suffer incredibly disproportionately from various types of psychological distress. Gender diverse people and young people need these types of healing modalities urgently. We see really disproportionate rates of suicide among trans youth and trans adults, yet there are currently no protocols for working with trans folks. Psychedelic therapists are very rarely trained in addressing issues of gender diversity or even gender identity for that matter. And so trans and gender diverse people who really desperately need these therapies are largely getting left behind. So one of the ways that I work with these types of mental health issues in my own research is from the framework of identity affirmation. And so the idea is that we have these structural forms of oppression like stigma. Discrimination is a form of enacted stigma. We also can internalize stigma and really internalize these negative ideas about our identities. And that results in what social psychologists call identity threat. Identity threat is that anxious, destabilizing feeling that you get when you're being disaffirmed in your gender, when people are not seeing you, when you're erased, when someone is kind of projecting those heterosexist, transphobic ideas onto who you are and your experience. You have all of the negative experiences that come with that. That's identity threat. But that identity affirmation is sort of an antidote to that. Affirmation can happen in all kinds of ways, like social affirmation, where people are communicating to you that they see you. Trans people sometimes seek medical affirmation through things like hormone therapies. But ultimately, affirmation leads to improved health outcomes. And I am really thinking a lot about how psychedelics and psychedelic therapy experience can bolster this idea of identity affirmation. And I want to share with you a story. I'm not sure if any of you were lucky enough to be there, but this is a story that was told by Gina Eichenbaum and was published by Chacruna. So you can read it there. You can also watch the video where she gave this presentation at Cultural and Political Perspectives on Psychedelics a couple of years ago at CIIS. So Gina told a story about her journey as a trans woman who had initially in her gender journey felt a lot of shame about her feelings of identifying as a woman. And so prior to her transitioning, she encountered a man who was a self-proclaimed shaman who turned out to be quite transphobic and homophobic, but he did agree to work with her, and essentially after some preparation gave her a 450 microgram dose of LSD. And this was an attempt to rid her of her sense of being trans or of identifying as a woman. And she tells the story about how during her LSD trip, she encountered God and essentially told God everything she ever felt shameful or guilty about. And then she gave this quote, "And the voice again, only this time not loud at all, but rather gentle and filled with care, asked, 'Is there anything else?' I paused, swallowed, and said, 'Yes, there's one more thing. I want to be a woman.' There was a long pause. I could hear the desert. When rustling through the cacti, I could hear nothing. The long, empty moan of nothing. Then suddenly, in a sing-song lilt, the voice playfully asked with a note of the trickster, 'What's wrong with that?' And she goes on to talk about how affirming that was, like all of these things that she felt shameful and guilty about, and this one thing that she's really holding on to is really just not a big deal in the context of this mystical experience that she was having. So psychedelics can be very affirming of a person's identity, sometimes in unexpected ways. And psychedelic experience may present an opportunity not only to experience affirmation from the therapists, but to experience it deeply from within and perhaps even from a mystical source, like Gina described. So imagine if we could heal some of this trauma that is inflicted by society by bolstering this affirmation that we can experience in the context of psychedelic therapy. So some of the psychological theories that we're trying to think about or make sense of some of the healing that we're able to witness in psychedelic sessions, really stress things like the weakening of ego boundaries or ego death, the peak mystical experience, acceleration of emotional processing, and increased openness to experience. So in particular, the mystical and ego dissolution experiences that are often cited as the source of emotional healing also can have liberating effects on self-awareness and self-acceptance, particularly among sexual and gender minorities, but also among those who may identify as cisgender or heterosexual, and just produce this broader, more open sense of self. And intriguingly, double-blind controlled studies have shown that psilocybin can induce mystical experiences and actually produce long-term changes in this personality dimension of openness. And as I mentioned earlier, past kind of theories of personality have really speculated that personality is sort of fixed once you reach a certain stage of adulthood, or at least in an ideal world, become fixed, you reach identity achievement, and that's it, you're there. So personality is thought to not be very amenable to change. But so one high dose session of psilocybin can significantly increase the personality dimension of openness. And among those who reported a mystical experience during the session, their personality dimension of openness remained higher than baseline more than 1 year after the session. So these are actually, can be longer term impacts on personality. So when you think about openness and you think about being open, being more open to thinking about yourself in a new way, being open to new experiences, and also being more open to the experiences of others, we start to wonder, can psychedelics help to not only cure our internalized transphobia, sexism, heterosexism, but can we also start to cure some of these biases that we see in society, where we immediately place judgment on things like binaries, where one is ascribed the normal and the other the deviant. I really love this image from Imperial College. I'm not sure exactly which study it came from, but the idea, what this diagram represents is how psilocybin impacts the communication patterns in the brain. So there are actually the same number of lines in each diagram, but the diagram on the left is quote unquote normal brain communication patterns, or our default mode network, which you've probably heard that term. And the diagram on the left has increased network communication. So these lines of communication are freed up that allow us to think and make associations that are not normally accessible to us. So when we talk about disruption of the default mode network, this is what we're talking about interrupting these grooves in the brain, where we've reinforced our ways of thinking about ourselves, thinking about others, thinking about the world, and we interrupt that to make new connections and be open to new ways of thinking. So just briefly, as you know, MDMA affects the brain by increasing activity levels in different neurotransmitters in the brain, and folks with PTSD have been shown to have increased brain activity in the amygdala, which is associated with fear. So MDMA decreases activity in the amygdala and increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, where information processing takes place. So what happens when patients are processing trauma, and you may already know this, is that without MDMA, trauma can become very overwhelming. So the activity in the amygdala kind of overrides the information processing, and we aren't really able to access the trauma in a way that allows for productive processing. MDMA, by suppressing activity in the amygdala, allows difficult emotions and memories to come up without the same level of fear, and also to be able to access that prefrontal cortex where we can process things more readily. And this is really revolutionary for the treatment of trauma. And people who have undergone MDMA-assisted therapy for trauma say that it has done more for them in a single session than years of typical kind of talk therapy treatment. What I would like to see happen in psychedelic research is for us to start to expand beyond this idea of PTSD as something that happens in the past, and start to think about how certain people in our society, trans, gender diverse people, people of color, experience trauma in an ongoing way. Living in our society, in a racist, heterosexist, transphobic society is traumatizing in a continuous way. This is not something where we process our trauma and then can, move on. So how might MDMA therapy help us to access those kind of internal reserves of affirmation that we're able to experience in the psychedelic assisted therapy session, and move us forward into the future in a more resilient way, allow us all to really participate in breaking down these structures of privilege and oppression that we're working against. Those of us who are moving through the world, being re-traumatized, aren't able to participate in the same ways that people of privilege are able to. So these are some of the questions that I'm thinking about moving forward in my own research. So ultimately, I think psychedelics can disrupt your answer to the question, who am I? And I think that psychedelics really help us to see that we're the awareness that arises prior to thoughts. We're the awareness that is aware of our identities. We aren't actually our identities themselves. We're the space between the thoughts, the space that opens up between our consciousness and our identities. And when we open up that space with the assistance of psychedelics, that can be incredibly healing and incredibly liberating. It gives us some space to know ourselves before that social programming kind of kicks in. And I think this is where integration really is incredibly important, to keep that space open after the psychedelic experience, to continue to reinforce that idea that we are more than our bodies, we are more than our social identities. These things are very important. Our bodies and our social identities help us to function in the world. They shape how we experience our lives. But that healing experience of knowing ourselves beyond that can be incredible. And just to share a final quote, I'm going to mute myself really quickly. Okay. To share a final quote in thinking about how psychedelics experiences kind of relate to this sense of dissolution of socially constructed sexual and gender norms. This is a quote from Adrienne Marie Brown. "Decolonization of the imagination is the most dangerous and subversive form there is, for it is where all other forms of decolonization are born. Once the imagination is unshackled, liberation is limitless." So when psychedelics show us that we are more than our bodies, more than our cultural programming, we can learn to embrace and express all of ourselves beyond binary notions of humanity. And we can start to think about psychedelic research, think about the therapy that we provide, also beyond these categories, and also to think about how the categories that are imposed by society impact our experiences and impact how we approach these psychedelic experiences and therapies. So thank you. That's what how I'm hoping to provoke a conversation, discussion, thoughts and some of
awesome.
the things that I've been thinking about.
Jay, thank you so much. Could we give her a quick round of applause or some thumbs up? That was amazing. Or them, thank you. That was incredible. To start us off, if you have a question, please raise your hand, but I'm going to indulge myself and ask a question right off the bat. Jay, you mentioned that these things have been used to convert people or try to kind of use this as a psychological mechanism to take people out of their identity, to force them into some kind of thing that the system deems is okay. But do you also see that psychedelics provide people with that perception, and flipping that on its head, the ability to be more open, to actually be the ones with power to break down those dynamics and make real change because they have the keys to the power?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I think I think you really hit the nail on the head there, that the power comes from within the person to integrate their identities, to understand, sort of the impact that that social programming has had on them, and then become re-empowered from within to make those choices, make change. And the difference with conversion therapy is the desire of the therapist to impose a particular structure, especially a normative, quote unquote, normalizing structure, assumptions onto a person, and constructing them as having some kind of pathology that needs curing. And I think that's where we really get into trouble, when we don't examine some of those assumptions that we come with.
All right, and we'll follow up really quick is, how would you integrate something like that into therapy for people who don't realize their blindness or their bias towards those things in the structure? As a therapist, is it okay to bring a patient that direction and breaking down those barriers within someone, or is that something that they must bring up to the therapist themselves?
This is one of those things where I really do believe that we listen to the medicines, like let the medicine guide that process. And I think when we as therapists come to the therapeutic encounter with that openness to the best of our ability, we're also providing that open context for the client to step into.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, does anybody else have Anne's right on it. Go ahead, Anne.
Thank you, everyone. That was wonderful, Jay. You're always thought-provoking. Thank you so much. So first, I wanted to make two comments. One is that I was lucky enough to be on a female team working with a female patient with a MAPS person in phase 3. She specifically asked when we were screening her to work with 2 women. And for a variety of circumstances, we were able to make that happen easily. And it was a beautiful experience. It was great. The other thing, I'm so delighted you bring up looking at can we treat people who continue to be traumatized, that PTSD is not a thing of the past. I also was lucky enough to work with someone whose trauma was continuing. And there was much discussion about whether we should even have her in the phase 3 study. And I'm really glad we brought her in because she has done beautifully. Her CAP scores at the end of the study were not as great as some of the others because her trauma, she had a big traumatic event just before the last CAP score was done. But we know, the 2 of us who worked with her since speaking with her, that was a year ago, that she is doing really well. So we can't wait for her CAP scores for long-term follow-up. So I think that's a really important point that we put into the studies as we go forward, that we shouldn't just be looking at PTSD from the past. So thank you. I did have a question too, and I was intrigued by your concept of moving past assimilation and wondered if you could expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, I think that in the context of queering and the idea of queerness is really arose out of this idea that queer people were seeking to, rather than replicating the structures of heteronormativity, really wanted to kind of queer these ideas about what's normal in terms of sexual identity, sexuality, and I think this came up a lot, especially when gay marriage was really kind of front and center in terms of a political agenda. And there were some parts of LGBT communities that were really rejecting that prioritization by saying, we're not looking to replicate, heterosexual structures and be accepted as some normative idea of the nuclear family. And, you see a lot more expression of different family structures in queer communities. And so I think the idea of queering families, queering relationships, queering what marriage looks like, commitment, it's the idea that rather than unquestioningly assimilating into the structures that have been set up for us, that really exploring what's possible and what fits with who we are. That being said, I think that there are plenty of queer people who are married and have nuclear families and all of those things, and experience that as more of a choice. And so it's different, I think, when you've kind of explored your options and have been really open to ideas, and then say, this is what fits for me, rather than feeling like forced into some preconceived notion of what a normal family or normal relationship looks like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
I was also curious, Anne, if I could ask you a question about your comment. So you were talking about the client, the patient who was experiencing continuous trauma, and I was curious if your sort of framework for that case, or how you conceptualize the therapy, differed to address that than okay.
I would say no, because I think the best thing to do, as you said, is to let the medicine take the lead and let the participant take the lead. And so that was really how we functioned. Michael, who is my partner, certainly could speak to that if he felt we did anything differently. I don't think so. I think our job was to support her in her process wherever she was. So what do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I would say that we just offered a similar sort of supportive role that we would have otherwise. And this also was someone who was relatively therapy naive, who at the time was being so, was continuing to face some of the issues that had caused her trauma that brought her in the first place. So our role was a bit more supportive, and we helped her explore how she was responding differently to some of these situations now, both as a result of the MDMA she received, as well as some of the changes that she'd made in her life to put some distance between herself and the traumatizing individual. So it, ended up turning into kind of exploring and opening up some curiosity about how responses to this sort of ongoing trauma had changed. And now longer term, it seems that she is working with her therapist on kind of exploring the origins of the traumatic situation itself and exploring things about herself beyond just the trauma. So the therapy was a bit more dominated by the trauma than it might have been otherwise if it hadn't been continuing. But, we pretty much offered a very similar approach, and it felt like the MDMA allowed and the therapy she was receiving did allow the patient to have a lot more internal resources in order to face some degree of ongoing trauma. The other thing was the trauma that was going on was not the same sort of it was the same individual who'd caused this sort of life-threatening trauma that had gotten them into the study, but was not to that same degree. So there was some measure of safety and security that allowed them to participate.
Thank you.
Megan, go ahead and unmute yourself.
I'm coming. Okay, hi. I had a question for you because I specifically do research actually in gender, transgender healthcare in the Netherlands system here. And I think that something that I think was just important to kind of highlight is that oftentimes individuals who are gender diverse and who are seeking care, like you had said, within that cisnormative foundational sort of aspect of the system, it's cisnormative, where diagnoses are necessary for the individual in order to be obtaining access to this care. So I'm thinking like we can work one-on-one with individuals and you can work on in that type of setting, but then I guess kind of what I'm throwing in here is more minority stress situations with an individual where these problems are actually most of the time inherently outside of the individual. So you're working on things with the individual, but with transphobia, with a healthcare system that's not necessarily supportive of a trans background or is supportive of a trans background as long as it conforms to the binary norm of male or female. So trans female, trans male. And of course you have the binary, non-binary that falls in the in-between. But I think that for me, I just kind of wanted to highlight that in a situation, in a therapy, when you're working with an individual who identifies as trans or gender nonconforming or gender diverse, that individual is dealing with a system in which they do have to still obtain a diagnosis. So how are you then going about that within a session? I mean, I haven't started doing that myself. I'm just researching at the moment. But I thought that would be an interesting thing to kind of pose here and see what your thoughts were.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much to what you brought up, just the layers of that, because it's something that I deal with a lot in the research I do within the medical system is, even the most well-intentioned providers can perform, like can microaggress on their patients in ways, and the system is set up to do that. We have electronic health records that reinforce the binary over and over again. It's impossible for people to get called by their preferred name. Forget like third person pronouns. People just cannot deal. So the system is really set up to effectively erase the existence of transgender people. And so what we do a lot is try to come at it from both angles, where we're trying to educate providers and change systems, and at the same time working with transgender people to really fill up that well of internal resilience, of social support, of one of the things that we do a lot is we work with trans people to around things like anticipated stigma, anticipated discrimination. Okay, if this happens, what will your reaction be? Do you know ahead of time where you can report incidents? Working with the emotions that come up, the anger that comes up preemptively, so that when people feel really prepared and really resourced to go in and deal with those situations that are likely to be traumatizing. And it's unfortunate that they really have to take on that burden, because really the burden should be on the system to change. But in the meantime, when we can't change systems overnight, we also try to work with the community to kind of fill up that well. There was something else that you said that I wanted to address, but I lost it.
Yeah, well, I think actually like an interesting note, just kind of quickly to piggyback off of that, an interesting note within that, I mean, if you're looking at the current, for example, medical education in the United States, I mean, doctors are only getting 4 to 5 hours on LGBTQA, everything, they're only getting 4 to 5 hours of that. And you're then including sexuality with gender in one category when it's inherently different from one another. I mean, just because I identify as a queer individual does not mean that I don't identify as straight or whatever, or lesbian. So you can identify in multiple ways. And I think that in knowing that, then how are you then translating that within the system, where people are going to forever be translating their identities And I think that that's just something that's interesting, but I could go on forever and I just don't want to take up people's time. So I'll just quiet myself. I know we're going to talk to each other in the 22nd, so I'll talk to you then.
Yeah, more to come.
Shoshana had a question in the chat. Do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, Jay, thank you so much for presenting. It's just great to hear your voice in this community. Second of all, it's very curious about
Are other folks having a hard time hearing
Shoshana? It's
fix that in 20 seconds or less.
A lot of static.
How's that?
That's better.
very good.
That's better.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Phones every once in a while. Yeah, so it sounds like you've been looking at quite a few psychedelic studies, and I was wondering if there was any that popped out at you as being particularly limited by their lack of being, queer informed and their focus on the binary.
Oof. I think, I think I can't really, I can't like pull out a particular study and say this is like more problematic than others. I think that it's such a lens. And I love getting confirmation that there are therapist teams in phase 3 trials that are at least open to like same gender pairings. And I'm really glad to hear the loosening of that. And I think that really has come from people stepping forward and saying, this requirement doesn't make sense. This is based on assumptions that were made from a very traditional, very heteronormative framework. And there's no evidence for it. There's no reason why we need to continue to perpetuate this. And so I think with more people kind of coming forward and saying, here are some blind spots that we've had in the research to date, and biases that we can start to pull apart in our protocols, I think the research will start getting better and better. And I think, the fact that the vast majority of participants in phase 3 clinical trials have been white and straight is a reflection of how the research has been shaped, the questions we've been asking, how the protocols have been designed. And I think we're starting to see that evolve now. And I think we'll start to see studies get better and better. I had the privilege of working on a study at UCSF with Brian Anderson. It was a trial of psilocybin of long-term AIDS survivors. And the cool thing about it was that the preparation and the integration sessions were in groups. They were group-based. And we had very highly skilled group therapists who facilitated the groups. And I think that this starts to get at not only the idea that the current model is not sustainable from a costing perspective, but it's also group-based models give us the opportunity to think about therapeutic peer-to-peer therapy, the kind of social support that we can start to build in communities, to empower communities to heal each other, to provide these connections that can grow outside of the therapeutic context. But the Western medical model is very individual based. We think about things in a very individualistic way. So I think some of these types of approaches to study designs are going to become more prolific as more diverse voices enter the field. I hope that answers the question.
Can I say something real quick with that? I can't figure out how to raise my hand. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I'm one of the phase 3 therapists for the MAP site here in Boston, working with Anne. So I do want to just caution when we are thinking about the idea of what's sustainable and what's cost effective with this work, that when we think of the price tag of this full model of therapy, 2 therapists, 1 client, around $10,000–$20,000 coming through per person, there is the concern that there could be a push to somehow water down or eliminate some of the therapy in the name of cost effectiveness, which hasn't really borne out in the research, in that there was a recent study demonstrating that over a period of 30 years, there's an average cost savings of $100,000 per person treated with this model, given how effective it is. Granted, there is a need for looking at whether groups could be equivalent to the current model of therapy, but the way it's designed right now is in order to help people who might need for this to be covered by public insurance, to ensure that if they need individual therapy, then it's doable. Our experience was that we did have a number of patients who, you know, frankly, would not have been willing to or potentially able to engage in this work as a group, since they hadn't ever had any kind of group work. They were therapy naive. So if we're thinking about trying to work with people who are highly traumatized, completely naive to doing any sort of psychotherapy, having a trial that is, you know, a bit more expensive is certainly has its advantages there. And there is a bunch of work going on in MAPS looking at using this MDMA working group.
Oh, great. I'm really happy to hear that. I think that's really important line of inquiry.
Yeah, basically the idea is that, you know, in order to be sure that this trial was most likely to show efficacy, they just wanted to be sure to use what they would consider to be the absolute gold standard, and to be sure that insurance would cover an individual who needed that if for whatever reason they couldn't opt into groups, rather than trying to do a trial in the name of cost savings that then shunts everybody who can't afford to pay privately into a group setting, even if they're not going to benefit from that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Benoit?
Well, thank you again, Jay, for this presentation. It was really illuminating, and just, I think, shows how far we need to go, and also the potential of where this can be taken for really helping people. My question, I think you may have inadvertently somewhat answered with that last answer, but I was wondering, you know, we have a new psychedelic research center that is opening up here in the context of Mass General Hospital, which is going to be huge, and everyone's super excited about it, myself included. There's a number of centers that have just opened up, you know, in Hopkins and in other places, and there's a lot of people that are taking in a lot of money to study psychedelics. My question, from an institutional perspective, what do you see as the most important things, irrespective of just naturally, you know, trying to increase more participation with people who are gender diverse in terms of representation at different levels? What do you see from an institutional perspective needs to be done to increase the effect of this medicine in gender non-conforming populations?
I mean, I would love to see some, you know, specific trials with trans and gender diverse people to address the very unique forms of trauma that gender diverse people can experience. I'd also love to see specific trials looking at this idea of like gender dysphoria, or the distress that some transgender people feel when their gender expression doesn't align with their gender identity, and that can be you know, that can cause a lot of different kinds of kind of psychological issues, anxiety, depression, suicidality, and, you know, the ways that psychedelics can help us to both kind of detach from our bodies in a way, like really experience ourselves as something above, like separate and above and beyond our bodies, and also experience that sense of value of our bodies as a vessel, feeling that sense of sort of the body as a gift, and whatever that looks like, in all, being able to accept the body in all of its limitations as we age, as our shapes change and evolve over time, and really getting some distance from those messages that we've internalized about what our bodies should look like, what a woman should look like, what a man should look like, that we should even identify with these labels. And so I mean, I'm personally really passionate about thinking through, you know, these very specific kinds of things with trans and gender diverse people. And like you said, I think you said it very well. I think, you know, the most important thing as we advance our research agendas is to make sure that we have more diverse leadership teams, in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of disciplinary perspective, to be able to really kind of call out these blind spots and to make our therapies better for everybody. I think we'll just have more effective trials, and we'll be able to say that this works with different types of people. And I think that's happening. So thanks to leadership of people like Anne and everybody who's involved in what's going on in Boston. So I really congratulate you all, and we're seeing some of the same things happen out here in the Bay Area. So I think it's a really exciting time, and I think people are open to thinking through how we can be more inclusive in our approaches and therefore make the science better.
Thank you.
Is it okay if I jump in, Mac and folks? Hi, Jay. I'm part of the DOI team as well, and I'm a social worker by training. I'm a therapist now. And one of the things that, you know, across my own learning, I'm a gay male, so sexuality was definitely something that I was confronted with at a very young age, and knowing that it was, you know, outside of what is normal. For me, my cisgenderness wasn't ever something that I struggled with. So coming into social work and coming more aware of this, it's definitely been something that I've learned about and become more aware of. And I know, speaking, you know, for myself, and I think on behalf of this community, are there any things that you can enlighten us upon that people can become more kind of well-versed or more enlightened around gender, that people are struggling with this? I think, you know, a lot of people in this community, we can want to be the progressive person, right? And we want to think that we know all these things. But the truth is, like, when it comes down to it, some people, we just don't know what that experience is like to have a gender experience that isn't cis. So both for myself and also having conversations with other people that may not be as aware, is there any ideas or resources you can maybe share with us that we can pursue to become more aware of some of these other spaces?
That's a great question. I would really just recommend, there's so many resources online, books to read. I would really recommend just seeking out things that are written as like first person narratives from trans people and trans people of color in particular. Janet Mock has a great book called Redefining Realness, where she talks about her experience growing up as a trans woman of color. Of course, she has like an enormous amount of privilege now to be able to write the book from the perspective that she has, but I think she did a great job of kind of letting us into what growing up as a Black trans woman was like for her. There's a ton of resources on our website, our UCSF. It's the Center of Excellence for Transgender Health. So it's transhealth.ucsf.edu. There's resources for providers, for patients, for families. The family resource that I always love recommending is genderspectrum.org. If you're interested in thinking about working with trans youth, or if you encounter folks who are parents of trans youth, I get a lot of calls from parents when, you know, their kids are exploring their gender identity or gender expression, and parents wanting to be supportive but having no idea how, because they haven't had this experience. Gender Spectrum is just like an amazing resource for that. Thank you, Kellen.
I have a comment if it's not too late. Is it still going?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry, I had some construction
You
outside.
know, I
had to
think
move.
this has really been a wonderful presentation. And it's really a huge hurdle, really, because when you think of it, when you go to the doctor's office or you're doing a study on individuals, it's like, what are you, male or female? And there's not even a space for other. You know, so I think to really, you know, if you really, really, really want to do research, or you really, really, really want to change the medical society, you got to change the intake form from the beginning. Instead of saying male, female, or other, you ask the person, what's your gender identity? And you don't put it into have to circle something. Of course, that's going to be damn hard to do for research because you can't, you know, have a computer tally it up for you, right? So, you know,
Yeah,
but
I think
you know, maybe by some magic, there can be some, you know, focus on trying to look at the, you know, the little things that are contributing to it that, you know, make all the difference.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you're pointing out a foundational issue
Yes.
That we have in transgender health, where it sounds like a little thing, but it's actually, it is the crux of so many issues because, you know, largely we don't even know what the health issues trans people are experiencing, say on a federal level, like on a country, because we don't collect that data. You know, we don't collect that data in the census. We don't collect that data, you know, in any kind of federal way, like from the CDC.
Right.
So all of the studies that we have are local, often urban-centric studies that have thought through these issues. And on our website, we do have a data collection guidance for studies that want to be inclusive of transgender people in a way that computers can tally up, but is still inclusive enough. And it's a two-step question that if you're interested, you can look it up online, but we have some data collection guidance there that that studies can integrate if they want to be able to count their, because sometimes
cool.
people also come out to you if you don't count them on the forms.
You get a little clicker, you know, so you don't even you know, click the bubble that best represents you. Anyway, great. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Our time is coming to a close, and what we like to do is give Jae an opportunity to say some last words, maybe a call to action or what you see the future of the field may need.
I think that I think my call to action would be to continue to chew on this idea of positionality and reflexivity in whatever your realm is, you know, whether it's research, whether you're a therapist, whether you're curious, whether you're a peer, you provide peer support in psychedelic situations, to continue to think about how your own experience and your own identity shape, you know, what you're curious about, what your beliefs are, what you're bringing to that encounter. And to think about how to continue to expand that. And I think even just awareness brings change. So yeah, have fun with that. And I hope everybody stays safe for the holidays. It's been really lovely being with you today.
Thank you.
Awesome. So that will be bringing us to the end. I do just want to let people know that we have another DOI talk coming in February. Please stay tuned for our larger meeting Sunday, January 10th for BPRG with Bob Jesse. In the spirit and the nature of racial equity and social justice, thank you all for joining us today. This is how we do it. We must show up every single time, and we must commit ourselves to opening by which we perceive our world. Thank you all so much, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Thank you, Jae.
Thank you. It was
Thank
wonderful.
you.
Great
Thank
presentation.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. That was wonderful.
Thank you for coming, Marty.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.